At the family barbecue, my son-in-law came up to me and said, "Me and your wife are expecting a baby, you old man who can't get it up." I laughed out loud and said, "Don't worry, boy." Weeks later, I gave them a surprise. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." The smell of charcoal and grilled meat filled the backyard as I stood by the barbecue, turning the steaks with practiced precision. At 64, I'd hosted countless family gatherings in this same spot, watching my children grow up, celebrating birthdays and holidays, but something felt different about this Sunday afternoon. There was an undercurrent of tension I couldn't quite place, whispered conversations that stopped when I approached, glances exchanged between family members that didn't include me. Isabella moved through the crowd with her usual grace, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the heat. She wore that blue sundress I'd complimented her on just that morning, but she hadn't smiled at me the way she used to. Instead, she seemed to orbit around our son-in-law Melvin, laughing too loudly at his jokes, touching his arm when she spoke to him. Melvin had married our daughter Sarah 3 years ago, and from the beginning, I'd sensed something off about him. He was charming enough, successful in his marketing career, but there was an arrogance in his eyes that rubbed me wrong. The way he looked at me sometimes like he was sizing me up, measuring my worth. "Dad, could you grab more beer from the garage?" Sarah called out, her voice carrying that forced cheerfulness I'd been hearing from her lately. She was standing with her cousins near the pool, but even from a distance, I could see the tension in her shoulders. I nodded and headed toward the garage, but as I passed the patio table where Melvin was holding court with my brothers-in-law, his voice stopped me cold. "You know what, everyone?" Melvin's voice carried that particular tone of someone about to make an announcement. "I think it's time for some big news." The conversations around the yard began to quiet, people turning their attention toward him. Isabella appeared at his side as if summoned, her cheeks flushed with what I initially thought was excitement. "Isabella and I," Melvin continued, his arm sliding around my wife's waist with casual possession, "are expecting a baby." The words hit me like a physical blow. The beer bottles in my hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Around the yard I heard gasps of surprise, but underneath those sounds was something else. Something that made my blood run cold. Some people weren't surprised at all. My brother-in-law Tom actually chuckled, shaking his head like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Well, it's about time you two stopped sneaking around," he said, raising his beer in a mock toast. Melvin's grin widened, and he looked directly at me with eyes that gleamed with malicious satisfaction. "Poor old Donald here probably couldn't get it up anymore anyway, right, old man?" The laughter that erupted around the patio was like glass breaking in my ears. My own family, my own brothers-in-law, my nephews, even some of my friends, all laughing at the humiliation of a man they'd known for decades. I stood there, frozen, watching Isabella's face. She wasn't laughing, but she wasn't defending me either. She just stood there, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, looking at me with something that might have been pity. "Don't worry, boy," I heard myself say, my voice surprisingly steady. The words came out with a calmness that surprised even me. "Don't worry at all." The laughter died down a bit, confusion replacing the cruel amusement on some faces. Melvin's expression shifted slightly as if he'd expected me to explode, to rage, to make a scene that would justify his public humiliation of me. Instead, I just smiled. A quiet, knowing smile that seemed to unnerve him more than any outburst would have. "Congratulations," I said, looking between him and Isabella. "I'm sure this will all work out exactly as it should." I turned and walked toward the house, my steps measured and calm. Behind me, the party resumed, but with less enthusiasm now. My response had thrown them off, confused them. Good. Inside the quiet of my kitchen, I finally allowed myself to breathe. My hands weren't shaking, which surprised me. Instead, I felt a strange sort of clarity settling over me, like the calm that comes after a storm has passed. I'd known about Isabella and Melvin for 4 months now. I'd known about the pregnancy for 3 weeks. What I hadn't known was that they would be cruel enough to humiliate me publicly, to turn my own family gathering into the stage for their betrayal. That knowledge stung more than the affair itself. I walked to my home office and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was a manila folder I'd been building for months. Photos, dates, times, financial records, everything I'd need when the time came. But there was one more thing I needed to confirm, one piece of the puzzle that would determine exactly how this game would end. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized weeks ago. "Doctor, Patterson's office, the receptionist answered. This is Donald Mitchell. I'd like to schedule an appointment for a paternity test as soon as possible. Through the kitchen window, I could see the party continuing in my backyard. Isabella and Melvin stood close together, accepting congratulations from people who should have been horrified by what they'd just witnessed. Instead, they were celebrating. But as I watched Melvin's smug face, as I saw the way he kept glancing toward the house where I stood, I realized something that made me smile again. He had no idea what he'd just set in motion. 4 months earlier, I had been a different man. Trusting, perhaps naively so, in the woman I'd shared my life with for 38 years. Isabella and I had weathered the usual storms of marriage, financial stress when the kids were young, the grief of losing both our parents, the empty nest syndrome when Sarah finally moved out. But we'd always been a team, or so I'd believed. The discovery came by accident, the way these things often do. I'd been working late in my home office, finalizing some contracts for the construction company I'd built from nothing. It was past midnight when I heard Isabella's phone buzzing insistently on the kitchen counter. She'd fallen asleep on the couch, watching one of her shows, and the sound was clearly going to wake her. I walked over to silence it, thinking I was being considerate. The screen showed a text message from someone named M, just the letter M. Can't wait to hold you again tomorrow. The hotel room is booked. My finger hovered over the screen, my brain struggling to process what I'd just read. Hotel room, tomorrow. Isabella had mentioned having lunch with her sister tomorrow, a monthly tradition they'd maintained for years. I should have put the phone down. I should have woken her up and asked her directly. Instead, I did something I'd never done in nearly 4 decades of marriage. I scrolled up through their conversation. The messages went back months. Intimate messages, planning messages, messages that detailed exactly how long they'd been betraying me, and worse, how little regard they had for me in the process. Donald suspects nothing. He's so focused on work, he barely notices when I'm gone. The old man's getting more pathetic every day. Can't believe you stayed with him this long. Soon, baby. Just a little longer and we can be together properly. I stood in my kitchen at 12:47 a.m. reading the destruction of my marriage in glowing text messages, and felt something inside me go very quiet and very cold. The M was Melvin, our son-in-law, the man who called me dad at family dinners, who I'd helped get his first promotion by introducing him to clients from my construction business. I took photos of every message with my own phone, my hands steady despite the tremor I felt in my chest. Then I carefully placed Isabella's phone back exactly where she'd left it and returned to my office. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my leather chair, staring out at the dark backyard where we'd hosted so many happy family gatherings, and began to plan. The next morning, Isabella kissed my cheek before leaving for her lunch with Linda. She smelled like the perfume I'd bought her for Christmas, the expensive one she claimed to save for special occasions. I might be late, she said, adjusting her hair in the hallway mirror. You know how Linda gets when she starts talking about her divorce? I nodded and smiled. Take your time, sweetheart. I'll probably work late anyway. But I didn't work late. Instead, I drove to the Marriott downtown and waited in the parking garage. At 2:15 p.m., I watched my wife of 38 years walk through the lobby with our son-in-law, his hand possessively on the small of her back. They took the elevator to the 7th floor. I waited in my car for 3 hours, documenting everything with time-stamped photos. Over the following weeks, I became a man I didn't recognize, methodical, patient, cold. I installed security cameras around our property under the guise of protecting against a rash of neighborhood break-ins. I hired a private investigator, a discreet woman named Carol who specialized in matrimonial cases. How long do you want me to follow them? Carol asked during our first meeting at a coffee shop across town. Until I have everything I need, I told her. What Carol uncovered was worse than I'd imagined. The affair had been going on for over a year. It had started, according to the detailed timeline she provided, just 2 months after Sarah and Melvin's wedding. While I was paying for their honeymoon, my new son-in-law was already seducing my wife. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was reading their messages about me, their cruel jokes about my age, my supposed sexual inadequacy, my trusting nature. They didn't just not love me, they actively despised me, even as they lived in my house and spent my money. He's so pathetic, one of Isabella's messages read. Still brings me coffee in bed like we're newlyweds. If he knew what we did in that bed when he's at work, he'd probably have a heart attack. Melvin's response. Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing. Speed up our timeline. That message, suggesting they were waiting for me to die, was when I realized this wasn't just an affair. This was a complete reconstruction of my life without my consent, and they were just waiting for nature to remove the obstacle I represented. But there was one message that stopped me cold, that changed everything about how this story would end. It was from 3 weeks ago, right around the time Isabella started acting differently, more nervous, more attentive to me, but in a guilty way. "I'm pregnant," Isabella had texted Melvin. His response came quickly. "Are you sure it's mine?" "I don't know. Donald and we were together that week you were out of town. I thought we were done with that. But he initiated and I couldn't refuse without making him suspicious." "Jesus, Isabella, what if it's his? Then we'll deal with it. No one would ever suspect anyway. Everyone knows how old he is." I read that exchange 17 times before it fully sank in. Isabella was pregnant, but she wasn't sure who the father was. And they were planning to pass the child off as Melvin's regardless, using my age as cover for their deception. But there was something they didn't know, something that would make their little plan impossible. 3 years ago, after a routine physical, my doctor had recommended I get tested for various age-related health issues. One of those tests had revealed that I had an extremely rare genetic marker, something that would definitely show up in any child of mine. It was the kind of thing that would be impossible to fake or hide in a paternity test. As I sat in my office that night, holding the private investigator's final report, I realized that Isabella and Melvin had made a critical error. They'd underestimated me completely, assuming I was too old, too trusting, too weak to fight back. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Isabella's voice came through, bright and cheerful. "Hi, honey. I'm going to stay late at Linda's tonight. She's having a rough time with the custody arrangements." Through my newly installed security cameras, I could see her car wasn't in Linda's driveway. It was parked at the same hotel where she'd been meeting Melvin for months. "Of course, sweetheart," I said into the phone. "Take all the time you need." After I hung up, I opened my laptop and began typing an email to my attorney. It was time to put my plan into motion. The weeks following my discovery became a masterclass in acting. Every morning, I woke up next to a woman who was carrying either my child or my son-in-law's child, and I had to pretend everything was normal. I brought Isabella her coffee in bed, kissed her forehead, asked about her day, all while knowing exactly where she'd been and what she'd been doing. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was watching her lie so effortlessly to my face. "How was lunch with Linda yesterday?" I'd ask over breakfast, already knowing she'd spent 3 hours in room 717 of the Marriott with Melvin. "Oh, you know Linda," Isabella would reply, not missing a beat. "She's still struggling with the divorce. Poor thing needed someone to listen." I'd nod sympathetically, even offer to send Linda some flowers, while inside I marveled at how easily the deception came to her. 38 years of marriage, and I was discovering I'd been living with a stranger. But I was learning to be a stranger too. I started varying my routines, coming home at unexpected times, suggesting spontaneous dinner dates, not because I wanted to catch them in the act. I already had all the evidence I needed, but because I wanted to see how they'd react under pressure. The first time I came home early and suggested we go out for dinner, Isabella's face went through a fascinating series of micro-expressions: surprise, panic, calculation, and then forced delight. "What a wonderful idea," she said, but I caught her glancing at her phone. "Let me just freshen up." While she was upstairs, I watched her send a quick text. 20 minutes later, as we sat in our favorite restaurant, Melvin called Sarah with some excuse about working late. My daughter sounded disappointed, mentioning they'd had plans. I realized then that their affair wasn't just hurting me. It was affecting our entire family, creating lies and disappointments that rippled out to everyone we loved. "You seem distracted lately," I mentioned to Isabella as we shared the tiramisu she'd always loved. "Is everything all right?" She reached across the table and took my hand, her wedding ring catching the candlelight. "I'm just tired, honey. You know how it is at my age." At her age, she was 62, hardly ancient, but she was already laying the groundwork for her pregnancy announcement, preparing everyone to believe that her condition was unexpected, miraculous even, rather than the result of a calculated affair. I squeezed her hand gently. "We should probably see Dr. Morrison for a checkup soon, make sure everything's healthy." A flicker of something crossed her face. Fear, maybe. "Oh, I don't think that's necessary. I feel fine." but I'd already made the appointment. The next phase of my plan involved getting closer to Melvin himself. If I was going to destroy him, I needed to understand exactly who I was dealing with, so I started inviting him to things: golf, dinner, father-son conversations about his career and his marriage to Sarah. "You seem really happy lately," I mentioned during one of our golf games, watching him line up a shot on the 7th hole. Melvin's smile was genuinely pleased, which disgusted me. "Life's good, Dad. Really good. Sarah and I are thinking about starting a family soon." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. He was sleeping with my wife, possibly fathering her child, while talking to me about starting a family with my daughter. The compartmentalization required for that level of deception was almost impressive. "That's wonderful," I managed. "Sarah would make an excellent mother." "She would," he agreed, then paused. "Actually, can I ask you something kind of personal?" I nodded, curious where this was going. "How do you do it? Stay so energetic at your age? I mean, you're 64 and you still seem so vital. I hope I'm like that when I'm older." The irony was staggering. He was asking me for advice on aging while actively stealing my wife and mocking my supposed decline behind my back. "Good genes, I suppose," I said, "and staying active. Though I have to admit, Isabella keeps me young." His expression shifted slightly at the mention of her name. A micro-expression of guilt, maybe, or possession. "She's an amazing woman," he said carefully. "She is. I'm very lucky to have her." That evening, I found Isabella in our bedroom, staring at herself in the full-length mirror. Her hand was pressed against her stomach, and there was something vulnerable in her posture that reminded me of the young woman I'd fallen in love with 4 decades ago. For a moment, just a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. "Penny, for your thoughts," I said softly. She startled, then forced a smile. "Just wondering if I should start doing more yoga. I feel like I'm getting soft around the middle." Another lie. She was probably wondering if she was starting to show, calculating how much longer she could hide the pregnancy. "You look beautiful," I told her, and meant it. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the lies, she was still beautiful. That made it worse somehow. She turned and kissed me then. Really kissed me, with something that felt almost like desperation. For a moment, I wondered if she was having second thoughts, if some part of her regretted what she'd set in motion. But when she pulled away, her eyes were already distant again, her mind somewhere else, or with someone else. "I love you, Donald," she whispered. "I love you too," I replied, and in that moment, both of us were lying. The next morning brought a new development. Sarah called, crying, "Dad, can you come over?" Melvin and I had a huge fight and he stormed out. I don't know where he went. I knew exactly where he'd gone. The same place he always went when he needed to escape his real life, to my wife's arms. I drove to Sarah's house, finding her curled up on her couch, tissues scattered around her. My daughter looked so young and vulnerable that I felt a fresh wave of rage at what Melvin was putting her through. "What happened, sweetheart?" "I suggested we should start trying for a baby," she said through her tears. "I thought he'd be excited, but he got this weird look on his face and said the timing wasn't right. Then he started accusing me of trying to trap him, like I was some kind of gold digger." The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. Melvin was angry at Sarah for wanting what he was already getting from her mother: a baby, a family, a future. Just not with the woman who deserved it. He said some terrible things, Dad. About marriage being a trap, about how women always want to tie men down with children. It was like he was a completely different person. I held my daughter while she cried and made a decision. This couldn't wait any longer. Sarah deserved to know the truth, and Melvin and Isabella deserved to face the consequences of their choices. But first, I had one more card to play. I pulled out my phone and called the private investigator. "Carol, it's Donald Mitchell. I need you to do one more thing for me." "What do you need?" "I want you to follow them to their next meeting. But this time, I want Sarah to see it too." There was a pause. "Are you sure about that, Mr. Mitchell? Once your daughter sees this, there's no going back." I looked at Sarah, still crying over a man who was betraying her in the worst possible way. "I'm sure. It's time for the truth to come out." The game of silence was about to end, and when it did, everyone would finally see exactly who Melvin really was. The meeting with my attorney, Robert Hawkins, took place on a Tuesday morning while Isabella thought I was at a routine business meeting. Robert had been handling my legal affairs for 15 years, ever since I'd started expanding the construction company. He was a shrewd man in his 50s who'd seen enough messy divorces to know exactly what I was facing. "This is a complex situation, Donald," he said, spreading the evidence Carol had gathered across his mahogany desk. "The affair is clearly documented, but the pregnancy complicates things considerably." I leaned forward in my chair. "How so?" "If the child is yours, Isabella could claim you were trying to deny your own offspring out of spite. If it's Melvin's, she could argue temporary insanity or emotional distress from an unwanted pregnancy. Either way, she'll have leverage." Robert picked up one of the photographs Carol had taken, showing Isabella and Melvin entering the hotel together. "However, there are some things working in your favor. The length of the affair, the premeditation shown in these text messages, and most importantly, the financial implications." He pulled out a thick folder I hadn't seen before. "I took the liberty of having our forensic accountant review your assets. There are some interesting discoveries." My stomach tightened. "What kind of discoveries?" "Isabella has been moving money, Donald. Small amounts, but consistently over the past 8 months. About $3,000 a month from your joint checking account into a separate account you're not aware of." The betrayal kept deepening. It wasn't just emotional anymore. It was financial too. "Where's the money going?" "An account she opened in her maiden name. The deposits correlate almost exactly with her hotel meetings with Melvin. She's been funding their affair with your money." Robert slid a bank statement across the desk. $24,000 taken from our joint account in small increments that I'd never noticed. Money I'd earned from 40 years of building my business, used to pay for hotel rooms where my wife betrayed me. "There's more," Robert continued. "I've also discovered that Melvin has been having financial troubles. His marketing firm lost 2 major clients 6 months ago, and he's behind on his mortgage payments. The affair might not just be emotional, it could be strategic." The pieces started falling into place. A younger man facing financial ruin, seducing an older woman whose husband was financially stable. It was possible that Melvin had targeted Isabella specifically because of our wealth. "What are my options?" I asked. Robert's smile was predatory. "Given the evidence of the affair, the financial misconduct, and the potential fraud involved in misrepresenting the child's parentage, we have several avenues. But first, we need that paternity test, already scheduled for next week." "Good. In the meantime, I suggest we take some protective measures." Over the next hour, Robert outlined a strategy that was both comprehensive and devastating. We would secure my assets, document every instance of misconduct, and prepare for multiple scenarios depending on the paternity results. But the most important element was timing. "We wait until after they make their public announcement," Robert advised. "Let them commit fully to their story. Let them get comfortable with their lies. Then we destroy them with the truth." That afternoon, I met with my banker, Margaret Collins, a sharp woman who'd helped me weather several business challenges over the years. She listened without judgment as I explained the situation and my need to protect my assets. "I want to move our major accounts into individual ownership," I told her, "and I want to establish a new business account that Isabella doesn't have access to." Margaret nodded efficiently. "We can do that. Given the circumstances, I'd also recommend placing a fraud alert on all your accounts. If she's been moving money without your knowledge, she might escalate." Within 2 hours, I'd restructured my entire financial life. The joint accounts remained open, but with minimal balances. Our savings, investments, and business accounts were now solely in my name. Isabella would still have access to enough money for daily expenses, but she couldn't drain our life savings to fund her new life with Melvin. The next stop was the most painful. A visit to my daughter Sarah. I found her in her garden, trying to distract herself with the rose bushes she'd inherited from my mother. She looked up when she heard my car, and I could see she'd been crying again. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to check on you, and I need to tell you something important." We sat on her back porch, the same porch where I'd taught her to tie her shoes 25 years ago. "How do you tell your daughter that her husband and her mother have been betraying both of you?" "Sarah, I need you to promise me something. No matter what happens in the next few weeks, no matter what you see or hear, I want you to remember that you are the most important thing in my life. You and your happiness." She frowned, studying my face. "Dad, you're scaring me. What's going on?" "I can't explain everything right now. But I want you to know that if Melvin ever makes you feel like you're not enough, like you're not worthy of love and respect, he's wrong. Do you understand?" Tears started forming in her eyes. "Is this about our fight? About the baby thing?" Partly. Sarah, you deserve a man who sees you as a gift, not a burden. You deserve someone who would never make you cry the way you've been crying. I could see the confusion and fear in her expression, but I couldn't say more. Not yet. She needed to see the truth for herself, or she'd never fully believe it. That evening, I implemented the final piece of my preparation. I called Melvin. "Hey Dad, what's up?" His voice was casual, friendly, the voice of a man who thought he was winning. "I've been thinking about our conversation on the golf course, about family and the future. Yeah, I want to do something special for you and Sarah. What would you say to a weekend getaway? My treat. Maybe that resort in Napa you mentioned." There was a pause. I could practically hear him calculating, trying to figure out if this was some kind of trap. "That's really generous, Dad, but I'm pretty busy with work right now. It doesn't have to be this weekend, just sometime soon. I feel like we should spend more time together as a family." "Sure, yeah, let me talk to Sarah about it." After I hung up, I realized I was smiling. Melvin was nervous, probably wondering if I suspected something. Good. Let him worry, let him make mistakes. The final element of my preparation was the hardest, getting ready emotionally for what was coming. I spent that evening going through photo albums, remembering the life Isabella and I had built together, our wedding day, Sarah's birth, family vacations, quiet moments of happiness that had once seemed unshakable. It was important to remember the good times, not because I wanted to reconcile, but because I needed to understand exactly what I was losing and what they had destroyed. I found a photo from Sarah's wedding day, just 3 years ago. Isabella and I stood together, beaming with pride as our daughter danced with her new husband. We looked happy, united, like a couple who'd weathered life's storms together. How quickly things could change, how easily trust could be shattered. My phone buzzed with a text from Isabella. "Working late again tonight. Don't wait up." I knew she wasn't working late. She was with Melvin, probably planning their future together, maybe discussing baby names for a child whose parentage they weren't even sure of. I typed back, "Love you. Be safe." One more lie in a relationship that had become nothing but lies. Tomorrow, I would get the paternity test results. Tomorrow, I would know whether the child Isabella was carrying was mine or Melvin's. And tomorrow, I would begin the final phase of my plan. But tonight, I would mourn the end of my marriage and prepare for war. The call from Dr. Patterson came on a Thursday morning while I was reviewing construction plans in my office. Isabella was at her weekly hair appointment, or at least, that's what she told me. I'd stopped checking her real whereabouts weeks ago, focusing instead on gathering the final pieces of evidence I needed. "Mr. Mitchell, the results are ready," Dr. Patterson said in his professional tone. "Would you like me to go over them with you in person, or can we discuss this over the phone?" "Just tell me," I said, setting down my pen and preparing for either outcome. "The test confirms paternity. You are the biological father." I sat back in my chair, feeling a complex mix of emotions I hadn't expected. Relief, anger, vindication, and underneath it all, a strange sort of sadness. The child Isabella was carrying was mine, which meant that everything Melvin thought he was getting, the woman, the family, the future, was built on a lie. "Doctor, I need you to prepare a formal report with all the technical details, and I need copies of everything." "Of course, Mr. Mitchell, if you don't mind me asking, are you all right? This situation seems complicated." Complicated was an understatement. "I'm fine, doctor. Better than fine, actually." After hanging up, I sat in the quiet of my office and let the implications sink in. Isabella and Melvin had been planning their life together around a child that wasn't his. They'd humiliated me publicly, stolen my money, destroyed my family, all for a future that was never going to happen. But there was something else. Something that made this revelation even more devastating for them. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a text Isabella had sent Melvin just 2 days ago, one that Carol had intercepted through the surveillance equipment we'd installed. "He's asking about baby names. I think he suspects something. We need to be more careful." Melvin's response, "Let him suspect. Once the baby comes, we'll have everything we need to start over. He'll be too destroyed to fight us." They were planning to take everything. Not just leave me, but destroy me completely in the process. The baby was their insurance policy, their way of claiming moral superiority while they gutted my life. Except now I had proof that their insurance policy belonged to me. I called Robert immediately. "The paternity test confirms I'm the father," I told him. There was a long pause. "Well, that certainly changes the dynamic. How do you want to proceed?" "I want to confront them, both of them, together." "Donald, I'd advise against that. Let me handle this through legal channels." "No," I said firmly. They made this personal when they humiliated me at my own barbecue. I want to see their faces when they realize how badly they've miscalculated. That evening I waited until Isabella came home from her hair appointment. She looked radiant, her skin glowing with what people would assume was pregnancy hormones, but what I knew was the satisfaction of believing she'd gotten away with the perfect crime. "You look beautiful," I said, and I meant it. She did look beautiful, carrying my child while planning to destroy my life. "Thank you, honey," she said, kissing my cheek. "How was your day?" "Productive, very productive." I handed her a glass of sparkling water. "I have something I want to discuss with you." Her expression became guarded. "What about?" "I think it's time we had Melvin and Sarah over for dinner. A family dinner. There are some things we all need to discuss." "What kind of things?" Her voice was carefully neutral. "The future, family planning, responsibilities." I smiled at her, enjoying the way her eyes flickered with uncertainty. "I'll call them now." The dinner was set for Saturday night, 3 days after the barbecue where they'd announced the pregnancy. I spent those 3 days watching Isabella and Melvin, seeing how they interacted now that their secret was out in the open. They were more careless, more confident. Isabella touched her stomach frequently, and Melvin hovered around her protectively when he thought I wasn't looking. They'd started believing their own lie. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made our dining room feel especially cozy. I'd set the table with our best china, the set Isabella's mother had given us for our wedding. It seemed appropriate somehow. Sarah arrived first, looking tired but trying to put on a brave face for the family dinner. She hugged me tightly, and I could feel how much strain she was under. "Dad, thank you for doing this. I know things have been tense between Melvin and me lately. That's what family is for, sweetheart. We work through things together." Melvin arrived 20 minutes later, his usual charming smile in place but something nervous in his eyes. He'd brought wine, expensive wine that I happened to know he couldn't afford on his salary. "Sorry I'm late, Dad. Traffic was terrible." I noticed how he positioned himself near Isabella, how his hand briefly touched her back when he thought no one was looking. They'd gotten sloppy in their confidence. We made small talk through dinner, the conversation stilted and artificial. Sarah tried to bridge the tension between her and Melvin, while Isabella played the gracious hostess. Melvin kept checking his phone, probably reading supportive texts from Isabella that she was sending under the table. Finally, as I served dessert, Isabella's favorite tiramisu, I decided it was time. "I have an announcement to make," I said, standing at the head of the table. "Actually, several announcements." Isabella's face went pale. Melvin set down his fork. "First, I want to congratulate Isabella and Melvin on their relationship." I paused, watching Sarah's confused expression. "I know this might come as a shock to some people, but I've known about their affair for months." Sarah's gasp was sharp and painful. She looked between her mother and her husband, her face cycling through disbelief, horror, and devastation. "Dad, what are you talking about?" she whispered. I walked to the sideboard and retrieved the manila folder I'd prepared. "I have photographs, text messages, financial records. Your mother and your husband have been having an affair for over a year." Melvin started to stand, his face flushed with anger. "Now wait just a minute. Sit down," I said quietly, and something in my voice made him obey. "I'm not finished." Isabella finally found her voice. "Donald, please, don't do this to Sarah." "Don't do this to Sarah?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You've been destroying Sarah's marriage for a year. You've been stealing my money to pay for hotel rooms. You've been planning to leave with her husband and take my grandchild with you." I opened the folder and spread some of the evidence on the table. Photos of them entering hotels, printouts of their text messages, bank records showing the money Isabella had been stealing. Sarah picked up one of the photos with shaking hands. It showed Isabella and Melvin kissing in the hotel lobby, their body language unmistakably intimate. "Mom?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "How could you do this to me?" Isabella burst into tears, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of panic, of a plan falling apart. "I love him, Sarah. I'm sorry, but I love him. And we're going to have a baby together." Melvin reached for Isabella's hand across the table, and I realized they were still trying to salvage their story. "Actually," I said, pulling out the final document, "that brings me to my second announcement. I placed the paternity test results in the center of the table. The baby Isabella is carrying isn't yours, Melvin. It's mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Melvin stared at the document like it was written in a foreign language. Isabella's tears stopped abruptly. replaced by a look of pure shock. "That's impossible," Melvin said finally. "DNA doesn't lie," I replied. "Your entire plan was based on a false assumption. You thought you were stealing my wife and my future grandchild. Instead, you were just borrowing my wife while she carried my son." Sarah was reading the paternity results, her hands trembling. "Mom, you're having Dad's baby?" Isabella couldn't speak. She just sat there, her hand on her stomach, as the reality of the situation sank in. Melvin pushed back from the table violently. "This is insane. You planned this somehow. You manipulated the results." I smiled at him, the same calm smile I'd given him at the barbecue. "Did I manipulate the text messages too? The ones where you and Isabella joke about waiting for me to die so you could be together sooner?" I pulled out my phone and read aloud. "Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing. Speed up our timeline. That was your response when Isabella worried I might have a heart attack if I found out about your affair." Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair falling backward. I can't be here." She ran toward the front door, and after a moment's hesitation, she turned back. "Melvin, don't come home. Don't ever come home." The front door slammed, leaving the three of us in the wreckage of what had once been a family dinner. Melvin looked at Isabella with something approaching hatred. "You told me it was mine. You swore it was mine." "I thought it was," Isabella whispered. "The timing. You thought wrong," I said quietly. "Both of you thought wrong about a lot of things." Melvin stood up, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "You think you've won something here? You think destroying our happiness makes you the hero?" I met his gaze steadily. "I think taking responsibility for your actions makes you an adult, something you should try sometime." He stormed out, leaving Isabella and me alone with the ruins of our marriage and the echoes of our daughter's devastation. Isabella finally looked at me, her eyes red with tears. "What happens now, Donald?" I began clearing the table, stacking the plates with mechanical precision. "Now you have to decide what kind of person you want to be, Isabella. The kind who destroys families for a fantasy, or the kind who takes responsibility for what she's done." But as I carried the dishes to the kitchen, I already knew what my decision was going to be. The aftermath of that dinner unfolded exactly as I'd predicted, but the reality was more devastating than even I had anticipated. Within 24 hours, Sarah had filed for divorce. Isabella moved out of our house that same weekend, taking only what she'd brought into our marriage 38 years ago. I helped her pack, a gesture that seemed to confuse her more than my anger had. "I don't understand you, Donald," she said as she folded clothes into suitcases I'd bought for our honeymoon. "Why aren't you screaming at me? Why aren't you trying to make this harder?" I sat on the edge of our bed, my bed now, and watched her pack away pieces of our shared life. "What would be the point? You made your choice. Now you live with the consequences." She paused, holding the blue dress she'd worn to the barbecue. "Do you hate me?" The question hung in the air between us. Did I hate her? I'd thought I would, had expected to. But sitting there, watching her pack, all I felt was a profound sadness for the woman I'd loved and the life we could have had. "No," I said finally. "I don't hate you. I'm disappointed in you. I'm hurt by your choices. But I don't hate you." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "The baby is still yours, Donald. That hasn't changed." "I know. And we'll figure out how to handle that when the time comes. But Isabella, you need to understand something. Being the biological father doesn't mean I'm going to let you use this child to manipulate me or control my life." She nodded, but I could see she didn't really understand yet. She still thought there was a way back. A way to fix what she'd broken. 2 weeks later, Melvin showed up at my office. My secretary had tried to turn him away, but I told her to let him in. I was curious what he'd have to say now that his world had collapsed. He looked terrible. Unshaven, his clothes wrinkled, his usual arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like desperation. "I want to talk," he said, standing in my doorway like he was afraid to come closer. "Sit down." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, the same chair where I'd sat when I first discovered his betrayal. He sat heavily, running his hands through his unwashed hair. "Sarah won't see me. She's changed the locks, blocked my number. Her lawyer says she's asking for everything in the divorce." "And you're surprised by this?" I thought if I could explain. "Explain what, Melvin? How you seduced my wife while I paid for your wedding?" "How you spent a year laughing at me behind my back? How you stole my money to fund your affair. His face flushed red. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Isabella and I, we fell in love. It wasn't planned. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a printed email. This is from 8 months ago. An email you sent to a friend, talking about how you'd found the perfect solution to your financial problems. Quote, older woman, lonely, husband's loaded. It's like hitting the lottery. The color drained from his face as he recognized his own words. Carol found this on your personal email account. Seems you weren't as careful with your digital trail as you thought. Melvin slumped in his chair. Okay, fine. Maybe it started as, maybe I had ulterior motives, but I really did come to love her. Did you? Or did you love what she represented? Financial security? A way out of your problems? Revenge against a world that hadn't given you everything you thought you deserved? He couldn't answer, which was answer enough. I leaned forward. Here's what's going to happen, Melvin. You're going to leave Sarah alone. You're not going to contact her, harass her, or try to manipulate her into taking you back. You're going to sign whatever divorce papers her lawyer presents without fighting for alimony or assets you never earned. And if I don't? I smiled, the same calm smile that had been infuriating him for months. Then I release all the evidence of your affair, including the emails showing you targeted Isabella for her money. I send copies to your employer, your family, your friends. I make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are. His hands clenched into fists. You can't do that. Watch me. We stared at each other across my desk, and I could see the moment he realized he had no power left, no cards to play. There's something else, I continued. You mentioned at the barbecue that I couldn't get it up anymore, that I was too old, too weak. I want you to know that while you were bragging about stealing my wife, she was still sleeping with me. The child she's carrying. That's proof of just how wrong you were about my capabilities. The humiliation on his face was complete. Everything he'd mocked me for, everything he'd used to justify his actions, had been a lie he told himself to feel better about his choices. Get out of my office, I said quietly, and stay away from my family. He left without another word. 3 months later, I was sitting in a coffee shop near the courthouse, waiting for my daughter. Sarah had asked to meet, our first real conversation since the night everything came out. She looked older, but stronger somehow. The devastation had been replaced by a quiet determination that reminded me of myself. Dad, I owe you an apology, she said as she sat down across from me. For what? For not seeing what was happening. For not protecting you the way you protected me. I reached across the table and took her hand. You don't owe me anything, sweetheart. You were betrayed by people you trusted. That's not your fault. But I should have known. All those times Melvin was working late. All those family gatherings where Mom seemed different around him. I should have seen it. Sometimes we don't see what we don't want to see. That's human nature. Sarah squeezed my hand. The divorce is final next week. Melvin didn't fight anything, just signed the papers and disappeared. Good. You deserve better than him. What about you and Mom? Have you talked to her? I had talked to Isabella. Several conversations about the baby, about logistics, about the future. She was living in a small apartment across town, working as a receptionist at a dental office. The woman who'd once been the queen of our social circle was learning to live on a secretary's salary. We talk about practical things, the baby, arrangements. Are you going to try to work things out? I'd been dreading this question, but I owed Sarah honesty. No, sweetheart. Some things can't be fixed. Your mother made choices that changed everything between us. I can forgive her, but I can't trust her again. And without trust, there's no marriage. Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes, but understanding in her expression. What about when the baby comes? I'll be there. I'll be the father this child needs. But your mother and I will never be together again. 6 months later, Isabella gave birth to a healthy baby boy. I was there for the delivery, holding her hand through the contractions, cutting the cord when our son took his first breath, looking down at him, this perfect little person who'd emerged from such an imperfect situation. I felt something I hadn't expected, not just love, but hope. What should we name him? Isabella asked, exhausted but radiant. I'd been thinking about this for months. David, I said. It means beloved. Isabella smiled through her tears. David it is. As I held my son for the first time, I realized that Melvin and Isabella's betrayal had taken something from me. But it had also given me something. It had stripped away illusions and left me with truth. It had cost me a marriage, but it had given me clarity about what really mattered. Over the following months, I developed a routine. I saw David 3 times a week, taking him to the park, reading to him, teaching him the things grandfathers usually teach grandchildren, but fathers teach sons. Isabella and I were cordial, cooperative, but never more than that. She tried occasionally to suggest we could be a family again. For David's sake, she'd say, but I never wavered in my decision. One evening, as I was feeding David his bottle in my living room, Sarah stopped by unexpectedly. She'd been doing that more often since her divorce, rebuilding her relationship with me while establishing her independence. "He looks like you," she said, sitting beside us on the couch. "Poor kid," I replied, making her laugh. "Dad, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you ever regret how you handled everything? The way you exposed them, the timing of it all?" I considered the question while David finished his bottle and settled against my chest. "No," I said finally. "I regret that it happened at all. I regret that your marriage was destroyed and that our family was torn apart. But I don't regret telling the truth. You deserve to know who you were married to. I deserve to stop living a lie." Sarah curled up next to me, her head on my shoulder, the 3 of us forming an unlikely but peaceful family unit. "I'm proud of you, Dad. You could have handled this with anger and bitterness, but you chose dignity instead." As I sat there with my daughter and my son, I realized she was right. The old Donald might have raged, might have sought dramatic revenge, might have let the betrayal poison him completely. Instead, I'd chosen a different path. I'd taken control quietly, exposed the truth calmly, and rebuilt my life with intention. Melvin had called me old, weak, incapable, but in the end, it was his weakness that destroyed him. His need for easy money, his willingness to betray trust, his inability to build anything real or lasting. I was 65 now, starting over in ways I'd never imagined. But I was starting over with my dignity intact, my conscience clear, and a son who would grow up knowing his father was a man of principle. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic or flashy. Sometimes it's simply living well, choosing truth over comfort, and refusing to let other people's weakness become your own. As David fell asleep in my arms, I realized I'd won something far more valuable than any revenge could have given me. I'd won my self-respect back, and that was worth everything. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.